Okay, so last we left off before we went to the conference and we had all those special interviews, which I thought were great. I loved going to the Remind conference. But last we left off, we talked about what was it? What Christians believe? Was that it? What Christians?
About the Bible?
Going into our podcast. I'm already forgetting what we've talked about, Justin.
Well,
Ridiculous.
that's not good.
That's no good at all. Finding truth. Finding truth. What is the Bible? Okay, yeah, all right. So
I do believe we spoke on sufficiency.
yeah, the last thing we talked about was sufficient. Okay, so last time we talked about what is the Bible. Okay, and so at that point, we're talking about is it sufficient for Christian belief and faith and practice and things like that. But at that point, kind of Scripture is assumed. It's complete. It's total, right? We have our 66 books, and canon is closed. And I think we used some terms while we were talking about what is the Bible, but something we didn't really talk about. And so over the next few weeks, I'd like to talk about it, Justin, if you feel like it's okay to talk about these things. Is how do we get this? How do we get the Bible? Because I feel like a lot of people. I had a history professor, a church history professor, who taught a class called History and Formation of the Bible. His name was Dr. Keith Huey. You know him. You had him for a couple classes, I believe, as well.
Yep.
And he made the statement. He often made the statement. A lot of people feel like the Bible was, faxed to us or just showed up on our doorstep by UPS or FedEx. And I think that view is prevalent because you can go to any Barnes and Noble, you can go to any bookstore or hotel and slide the drawer out and find a Bible. You probably have, whether you go to church or not, you probably have at least one Bible in your home if you live in the United States and you profess in some way, shape, or form to be a Christian, whether you are or really not, whether you're a nominal Christian or whether you're a person who goes to church devoutly, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, you probably have a Bible somewhere in your house. And it's just a case in point. If you're like Justin and I, then you have several shelves of different types of Bibles. But
we have a sickness. We really do.
We do. It's a sickness for the Lord. A sickness for the Lord. No, but I feel like because the Bible is readily available, it is the most revered book on the face of the planet, as far as I understand. It is the most printed book. It's been retired from the New York Times bestseller list. It's also the most stolen book on the face of the planet, because I guess they count the ones that are in hotel rooms, and people take those all the time. I guess they count those. But because it's so readily available, I feel like people feel like, okay, or I think and I believe that people feel as if, okay, this was just transmitted to us via fax machine. It was just printed off, and that's kind of how we got this. And people don't really ask the question of, what did it take to get this book that we have?
Mm-hmm.
So I think over the next few weeks, we should talk about, how we got this. How did we get the Bible? How do we get the Bible? So what's a good starting point for that, Justin? What do you think? I mean, what are some criteria? I mean, how do we get this? How do we get the Bible?
Well, I mean, there's four criteria that pretty much every scholar, biblical historian is going to give you. There's more, but these four are always present. And that's that the letter or writing, the document, had to be apostolic. It had to be Catholic. And when we say Catholic, we're meaning universally used. We're not meaning Roman Catholic. It had to be Orthodox, which means that it had to speak to right theology, and it had to be inspired. Apostolic is the one that we should probably focus on tonight, which is dealing with how the apostles not the apostles, edit that. Apostolic is how the books that we have in the New Testament are written by or connected to in some way an apostle.
Okay, so all right, so it's got to be attached to, related to, written by an apostle. So that bears a question then. What's an apostle? Because I think you and I use the term apostle, and we've heard those words, and I think there was a movie called The Apostle at one point.
Yeah, with Robert Duvall.
With Robert Duvall. It's kind of a strange movie. It's a movie,
it
but
was
very, very strange, right? And
it was strange.
If people remember that movie, that's not the kind of image that that you want to conjure up. It's like, oh, that's who wrote this? Robert Duvall wrote the Bible? I don't want anything to do with that. Right? It's those crazy, snake handling type weirdos. So then I guess in terms of apostolic authority, I guess is a good word to put it. Those who are in authority, apostles. What is an apostle? What is that?
Well, I think you kind of have to go even further than that. And when we say apostle, when we say apostolic, we mean the 12 original apostles that Christ himself commissioned. We're not talking about apostles in general, because apostolos means one who's sent. So it is almost like it's almost the foundation word for where we get missionary from. Okay. So an apostle is essentially a missionary. Okay. But when we talk about the office of an apostle, the giftedness of an apostle, then we're dealing with something very, very different. Okay. So an apostle, in order to be an apostle of Jesus Christ, you had to have been with Jesus through his 3-year ministry, or had seen Jesus at some point in time and learned from him. Okay. This is why Paul could claim apostleship, was because Jesus knocked him off his horse and said, Paul, why are you persecuting me? And then he says in his writings on multiple occasions that he learned the gospel by himself because the Lord gave it to him.
Okay, so
told him what it was.
Then I think I should probably add one more criteria, because so what I'm hearing here is you're saying, okay, basically an apostle's, it's generally assumed to be someone who was with Jesus from the time of his baptism by John the Baptist.
Correct.
Beginning of his public ministry to his death and resurrection.
Correct.
Okay, so that's so that narrows it down as to who could be an apostle. But I think that another criteria exists for apostleship, and we'll talk about this when we talk about authorship, I think, here in a few moments, is the content, especially of the Gospels, had to be written by an apostle or by a disciple of an apostle during the apostolic era, which spans from 33 AD to 100 AD. That's my understanding. And so I think if you say only, had to be written by apostle, someone who spent time with Jesus directly, then that is going to eliminate some of the people who brought us a few of the Gospels. So that would be problematic. But some of the people who brought us the Gospels were disciples of apostles themselves. So they were with people who hung out with Jesus on this 3-year-long camping trip.
Right. We're dealing with, well, you asked me what an apostle was. So I told you what an apostle was. When we talk about an apostolic, that it has to be apostolic, we're talking it has to come from the apostolic era, which is that 33 AD.
Okay. Right. And that's what I was clarifying. So yes, you said what an apostle is, and I'm saying, what apostolic authority means. And so apostolic authority could be written by someone who was not an apostle, but they spent time they were a disciple of an apostle during that.
Well, and they were likely cross-checked by them. I mean, John Mark wrote Mark before Peter was executed.
Right.
I mean, even the earliest historians, even the historians that date Mark late, like 65, still think that he had it completed before Peter was executed. So because Peter
so
was executed late 65.
You've already gotten into it then there. So you
Yep,
brought up
sure
Mark.
have.
John Mark, not a disciple of Jesus.
No, this is the same
not
John Mark that we see in the beginning of Acts. Now, I don't know why people don't connect the dots here, but they don't. John Mark, this is the same John Mark that abandoned Barnabas and Paul when they first began their first missionary journey in the book of Acts. So that is who wrote the book, the Gospel of Mark, was John Mark, who later ended up kind of proving himself and then was so actually John Mark sat under two apostles. He sat under Peter and he sat under Paul when Paul was in Rome.
Okay. So let's talk about him particularly with Peter, though, because some people argue, and we can get to this at some other point, Paul can't be an apostle because he never actually met Jesus. Although I think he had a better experience than most of us have. He met him on the road to Damascus, right? But you do have Peter, who was, Jesus said, "Upon this rock, I'll build my church." I mean, some people take that to mean that he was the first pope and all that, and I don't agree with that assessment. But he was someone who Jesus knew, and Jesus is someone who Peter knew. He was a disciple of Jesus's. He was a person who denied Christ 3 times, and then Jesus reinstated his ministry, and then he went on to bigger and not bigger and better things, but to great things, and then ultimately gave his life in defense of the gospel. I believe, according to antiquity, when they went to crucify Peter, he said that I'm not worthy to be crucified in the manner of my Lord. So crucify me upside down. And so Peter was crucified upside down, according to church antiquity. And so this was somebody who spent time with Jesus. So that means that he would qualify as an apostle. And so if John Mark penned Mark, but he's not a disciple, but he spent time with Peter, that book could then carry that apostolic authority, because he's kind of almost like, I hesitate to use the term ghostwriter, but he is there with someone essentially, I guess, telling their memoirs, saying, I want you to get this right. No, that's not how it went down. Erase that, tear up that piece of papyrus. Let's start that over. You've got Peter there kind of guiding the process.
I think ghostwriter would be a strong word, but at the same time, it's not entirely inaccurate.
Okay.
Because we don't know if, Peter was literate. We don't know if Peter was literate, because for all we know, 1st and 2nd Peter could have been dictated as well.
Well, I guess I want to back off the ghostwriting, because ghostwriting is, hey, I'm an author who's too busy to write a story. You go ahead and write.
That's the modern day application.
Right. That's the modern. Yeah. So I don't want people to run with that modern day application of someone writing this story over here and this other dude getting the credit, and the ghostwriter getting a paycheck, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. There was no paycheck.
Yeah. Yeah. Unless paycheck is death. That is.
Yeah. Christians were rolling the dough.
Okay. So Mark spent time with Peter.
Yes.
And so his book carries that apostolic authority, right? So it could be included in the New Testament.
Yes. Yeah. And it's even, the Gospel of Mark even carries a very Jewish flavor to it.
Okay.
So you can kind of tell just in reading it. Well, I guess when you've read enough ancient text that's Jewish, that's not biblical, you can kind of acquire, that C.S. Lewis quote that I have come to love so much, in terms of, have you tasted the flavor? People who say that the Bible is a myth, I love that quote because it's so true. Someone who has read a lot of a particular type of text does acquire a palate in which you come to recognize certain flavors of literary text.
Right. I know what a myth is. I know what a myth tastes like, what it sounds like, what it consists of. I know what lore consists of. And right now, it was really interesting because after I gave that quote several weeks ago at this point, I came across a new podcast called Lore, and it's all about how we got some of the stories that we've gotten, like stories about Dracula, and he kind of goes into the history of that and
Mm-hmm.
how we got the story of, I guess, pixies and dwarves and things like that. And it starts off, and it's kind of very, very interesting. And it was kind of interesting to, I keep saying the word interesting, I'm sorry, to have read that C.S. Lewis quote and then to come across this podcast dealing with lore, and then thinking of it in relation to have stories built up around our understandings of Jesus and the Gospels and the New Testament and early church history and things like that. It has legend built up around those things, and it has lore built up around those things. And as I'm listening to this podcast, I realize that, okay, I can see how it got to that point. That's weird and that's strange and that's completely unrealistic. And then I look at Scripture and I look at the history of the church, and I'm going, totally different.
Yeah, there isn't any of that.
Totally different situation.
The Bible would look a lot different if it had been edited to look more like ancient myth. It would look very, very different. That's what people don't recognize, is that they say things and they've really never looked at what myth in that time period looks like. So they make assertions, without knowledge, which is I think common in the modern world.
And maybe we should do a podcast where we talk about Christianity amongst other gods and amongst other myths and things like that. Because I think that there are times where you've got polemical theology happening, where in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, where the Bible does seemingly, more specifically in the Old Testament, the Bible very, very closely resembles a lot of pagan mythology, and that was done on purpose to call into question the veracity of those pagan gods.
Yep.
And so it was done with reason. And then there are a lot of people who were very much like, oh, Jesus and Horus are the same, and Jesus and Mithras are the same, and Zoroastrianism, and all these different things. And we can get into that. I don't want to confuse the issue because that's not what we're talking about today, but we will definitely be tackling that down the way because I find that stuff very, very, very interesting. Just because I like myth and I like lore, and I've read some of these stories of these other gods that people say Jesus is like, and I'm like, that's kind of a stretch to think that, like, wasn't Horus born out of the side of a mountain and you're calling that a virgin birth? That's not really the same thing at all.
No.
But that's a different podcast entirely. But I do want to talk about, I want to talk about Luke. Okay. Because Luke is where I think a lot of Christians get into trouble. And it's the longest of the Gospels. It is actually part 1 of 2. All right. So the sequel is Acts. And Luke was not a disciple of Jesus, and he was not a disciple of Jesus. He was a co-laborer with Paul. And Paul was someone who Christians do consider an apostle, because on the way to Damascus, on his way to persecute Christians under the name of Saul, he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. God shines as a light, meets him on the road, knocks him off his high horse, blinds him.
Quite literally.
And we have this conversion experience where Paul literally meets the Lord. He literally meets Jesus, right? And so at that point, he is now in the same realm, I would say, as, a Peter. Because Peter spent time with Jesus. He met Jesus. He knew Jesus. Paul met Jesus. He didn't get to hang out with him. He wasn't at the transfiguration or anything, but he met a transfigured Jesus. That's for sure. Yeah. So you've got that. But Luke, while still a co-laborer with the Apostle Paul wasn't there. Paul wasn't there with Jesus during his 3-year ministry, right? He was an enemy of Jesus. So Luke relies primarily on eyewitness testimony. He's going and talking with people who were, hey, you know what? I heard that this woman, Sarah, might have been, she was there when Jesus supposedly turned water into wine. She was at that wedding. You might want to go talk to her. Okay, hey, Sarah, let's sit down. Let's talk. Oh, yeah, I was there. It was water. It was crazy. I saw it happen. It was nuts. It was the best wine I've ever had. Oh, okay, cool. And just kind of stories like that, meeting different people who were there. Yeah, I was there when he turned the 5 loaves and 2 fish into like, I don't even know how much was left over. It was a ton left over. I was full. And I was like, I can't take anymore. And the basket's passing by. I was there. It was amazing. It's like, yeah, dude, I was there when he showed up. There was like 500 of us there. And I was like, didn't they kill that dude? I'm pretty sure they killed him, but that's pretty. I know a dead body when I see one, and he's not dead at all. So you've got Luke interviewing people who were there. They weren't disciples, but they were eyewitnesses of the miracles and the ministry of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. Now, I remember growing up, and when I first latched on to apologetics, one of the big things for me was this eyewitness testimony thing. Like, how many eyeballs are on this? That's a big question that people ask. How many people saw this? How many people saw what went down? All right, let's talk to those people, get a statement, right? And so when I was hearing people like Josh McDowell in his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, which I actually have open in front of me right now, talk about that, I was like, yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, 500 people at one time having the same hallucination as a hallucination theory, that's kind of crazy. They saw what they saw, right? There were people who were at the wedding. There were people who were at the 5 loaves and 2 fish. There were people who were at the crucifixion. There were people everywhere who could say, when these books are being written, yeah, that didn't happen that way. Let me tell you how it really happened. But you have corroboration. Luke had enough eyewitnesses that he could create the longest gospel. But in recent years, so that was the thing that kind of held me down. I was like, that's amazing. You can't beat eyewitness testimony. But in recent years, I've come across the idea and the belief that, and Justin, you and I have been talking about this offline, and I want you to kind of get in on this, because this is not the Cal Moore Show. That's a different podcast, right? Yeah, this is a shameless plug. Go listen to that podcast. It's good. But in recent years, eyewitness testimony has come under fire. And I haven't heard it used in direct attack of Scripture yet. And I'm sure maybe I'm just missing it. Somebody might have done that. But I'm finding that more and more people, especially within law enforcement, are saying things in the hard sciences and things like that, are saying things along the lines that eyewitness testimony is notoriously not reliable. So when you hear someone say eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, what are your thoughts, Justin? When you hear that? Is there any truth to that?
Yes and no. Yes and no. There's truth to it in the sense that the way that it's being used in a criminal case or in a law case where you're dealing with specific instances of time, and there's running theories within education. There's a particular psychological theory called constructivism, where you give people enough ideas and they kind of construct their own knowledge. Okay. That happens with witnesses. That's one of the reasons why police try to interview eyewitnesses as soon as humanly possible, because they want to give that eyewitness as little time as humanly possible to reconstruct the scene. All they want is what they actually really do remember, not what the brain automatically makes these adjustments, right? So it says, well, this happened and I didn't really see this, but that was there. So that had to have happened. And then all of a sudden they're acting like they've got this they saw the complete activity of what was happening. And the reality of it is they weren't. They have constructed a new thing in their mind. Now, what's different about this versus what's going on in the Scriptures is that the Scriptures are many, 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 many instances, not just one, not just a moment in time, not just with 2 or 3 people present. The water turning into wine at the wedding likely had a couple hundred people there. That was something that would have been seen by quite a few people. Jesus performed, and that's one of the great things about Jesus performing miracles the way he did, is that he generally always did in front of a fairly large crowd. He never really did it, and you never see the Jews, the Pharisees, ever try to deny the fact that he performed miracles. Recognize that. I mean, we don't even see it in extra biblical literature. Jewish literature in the 1st and 2nd centuries tried to deny the fact that Jesus perform miracles, because he did, and they knew it, and they didn't try to deny it. They just tried to push it off onto something else, stating that it wasn't from God, that it was from the devil. But even the Jews, who were his greatest opponents, said, yeah, okay, perform miracles. So I think that it's a stretch to try to use the eyewitness theory as a way to discredit the works of Jesus during his 3-year ministry, because of all of the substantiating evidence that you have on the outside coming in. And so, you have criminal of law, you have a moment in time, an instance where you're seeing a crime or an atrocity occur within a moment in time, within a split second, okay? And you see the aftermath of that, but you can't talk to the person who was just killed and ask them, how did that happen? Right? But someone who just had their arm healed, well, how did that happen? Well, he did this, and he told me to do this, and yeah, I was standing right there, and okay, I just wanted to make sure that that's what happened. And it's one of those things where there are so many eyewitnesses corroborating. I mean, it's not just 5. Okay, so I think the article that you sent me, Kelvin, it had a thing about a gentleman who had been convicted of a crime, basically rape and murder, was sentenced to essentially the death penalty, and then 9 years later, they do some conclusive DNA evidence and find that he's innocent. Well, there's 5 eyewitnesses that pointed him to the scene, and they were all wrong, because DNA is much more conclusive. Okay, that's fine. But there were more than 5 people seeing Jesus perform these miracles. There were hundreds, sometimes thousands of people seeing him do this on a fairly regular basis. And if, like Luke says in the text itself, right? He says, these are the things that occurred. Go and ask them, right? He doesn't say these are the things that are occurred. If anybody says any different, they're lying. That's not what he says. He says, go ask them. Go talk to them about it, right? If you doubt that these things really happened, go talk to them, because I got it from my witnesses, right? So it's a very different thing. It's a very different thing than what they're dealing with in criminal court.
Yeah, and I think people are really, I think people get very hung up in procedural dramas and whatnot. Like, I'm a guy who loves shows that deal with serial killers. I don't know what it is. I'm not a sociopath, but I loved the show Dexter. I loved the early seasons of CSI. I even liked CSI Miami. I did. Everybody hated her. I know, right? But I liked CSI Miami. I liked Criminal Minds. I liked all that kind of stuff that kind of gets in the mind of the criminal and uses hard science. And they've even shown that juries, real life juries, are more interested in hearing the science of DNA evidence and things like that because of shows like CSI and Bones and other things like that. And so I've always kind of been one of those kind of guys where I love Jesus and I understand that miracles happen, but I also have an appreciation and respect for the hard sciences. Religion, the study of religion, falls under the social sciences, even though I feel it's just as real, if not more real, than the hard sciences. But the hard sciences are something that you can study under a microscope, right? I mean, you can't do that with faith. You can't study it under a microscope. But one of the things that I want to piggyback off of there, Justin, is just that there were a lot of people. And there were consistently a lot of people. And I've heard of the hallucination theory about Jesus' resurrection. Jesus appeared to 500 people? 500 or 300? 500 people, I think, right? So Jesus shows up, and like, did that many people hallucinate at once? And there's actually, I have an assignment right now to respond. That's one of the choices of my responses in my apologetics degree. We all have a choice of writing 5 different essays, and that's one of the choices. Like, okay, how do you respond to people who think that Jesus, people hallucinated that Jesus was there, a mass hallucination? But even if that were the case, like you said, Jesus constantly did things in front of crowds. It's like, were you there when he did the 5 loaves and 2 fish? I was there too. Like, I was over on this hill. What hill were you on? Oh, I was, yeah, wasn't that crazy? That was nuts. So you got enough people there. You got enough people who could say, no, he stole a lunch from a little kid and like 2 people ate. That was pretty much it.
Right.
No, you have someone who can do that.
He's the schoolyard bully who stole a little kid lunch.
Right, he stole a little kid lunch, right? But the thing I think about though is, okay, because of that, you've got because of that within me, I have a desire for things to make sense in a hard science kind of way. When you say this happened to a lot of people, you got to think that there's sensory perception here that is a very science-based thing. Like, people know the difference between and wine. They know the difference.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very, hey, you know what? That's water. Hey, I know the difference between, like, that's a very kind of thing that can be in the wedding. Who could say, yeah, I was there. They ran out of wine. That one dude who was like, yeah, I had no water in the wine. They brought more wine, showed up. Put up on a wagon later. Bruce Almighty into, what from one face was clear and it was one. I don't know if you Bruce Almighty, by the way, from one when it hits the other so quick.
Hey, Callie, you're really breaking up bad. I can barely hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. The recording will probably pick it up with no issue.
Okay.
So
I figured as much, but I just wanted to be sure. So
yeah. So you missed my whole Bruce Almighty joke. That
I
sucks.
did. I did. That's why I was sitting here not laughing.
No
I was
laughing.
Staring at you, stone face, dude. I was just like,
it was hilarious. It was hilarious.
I'm sure it was, and I'm sure it was
terrible. Anyway, other people were laughing at this point. So yeah, I'll edit in your laugh right there. Just laugh. Give me a fake laugh. No. So, but you had enough people that were there that I think that's enough of a group who have sensory perception, who could taste, touch, smell, feel, all these kinds of things, use the 5 senses. Yes, can that be misconstrued? Can that be misinterpreted? Absolutely. But when you have enough people, you have a corrective for those amongst the group that don't get it correct.
Correct.
You have enough people there.
Yeah.
And you have enough people to say that's not the way things went down.
I mean, you have an ability. Okay. If you got 5, even 10, let's say even 20, even 30, even 40 people, you can get 40 people all on the same page by bringing them all together and saying, okay, guys, this is what we saw. Right. But you're talking about like in one instance, 5,000. And those were just men. We're not even talking women and children, because in the ancient world, only men were counted. We're talking about 5,000 men, not including women and children. It's probably closer to 10,000 people there, okay, who all saw him do this. You are not going to get 10,000 people in a room and get them all to lie about the same thing. You're just not. And that's why, for me, when you look at the eyewitness testimony, and that's why Jesus did it the way he did it, okay? when you look at eyewitness testimony in the ancient world, okay, in a society, in a culture where oral tradition and written tradition meant something, and they meant something different than they do now, okay, because now it's just the attributed, it's just the communication of facts and data. It's got nothing to do with reconstructing an accurate narrative. It's just about giving raw data, okay. And anybody who falls asleep reading the newspaper nowadays can see that. In the ancient world, it was very different. So when we see all these eyewitness testimonies and we see that thousands of people witness these things and that they all say the same thing, I'm going to say this as nicely as I can, to attempt to discredit that is to, on some sense and level, be a little insane.
Now, let me, and this might be a question. This is kind of a curveball here. As I'm sitting here thinking, and this is the great thing about doing a degree in apologetics is the more questions I have answered, the more questions I have, and the more I realize how faith is important. But I'm just thinking of the logistics. Here's where I'm willing to play devil's advocate on the eyewitness testimony thing. And I'm not trying to discredit Apostolic Authority by any means, but if I were among 10,000 people, okay, and we believe that Jesus is one man, the God man, 100% God, 100% man, but he took on human form, right? 10,000 people cannot get that close to one person.
No.
So in the event that Jesus turns water into wine at a wedding, there might be 200-300 people. Did he stop everyone and say, hey, I'm up on stage, watch, I'm going to do this magic thing, boom, it's all, and everybody saw it that way? Or was it, oh my God, were there like 4 or 5 people that saw it happen and then went and told everybody else at the wedding? Is that how that kind of thing happened when you've got 10,000 people who can't rush in on Jesus? He might have turned the 5 loaves and 2 fish into bread. You got the disciples who were there. Okay, that happened. And then there is enough food and everybody can eat. But how does a person out on the edges not know whether or not Jesus performed a miracle or whether they just brought all this food in?
Right. Well, I mean, you've got, number one, going to bring in enough food to feed 10,000 people. People are going to notice. the logistics behind that, especially in the ancient world, that would not have been a thing that would have been hidden. That would have been a thing that very much so would have been noticed because of the amount of chariots and wagons and all that kind of fun stuff that would be necessary to, get that much food out to the hills of Galilee. That being said, I concede your point. The thing for me is that it's not like with a eyewitness testimony in a crime event. It's an event, and then it's over, and generally the perpetrator of said event is gone. Okay, they escape. They're not sticking around for you to talk to them about what happened. Jesus, on the other hand, 200 or 300 people at a wedding might not have seen what happened, but they might have heard about it and then gone up to Jesus and said, I heard you did this. Did you actually do this? And yeah. And they sit down and they actually get to talk with the guy afterwards. On some level, that almost adds even more credibility to what's going on there. Because you've got not only corroboration, but now you've got follow-up questions. And people ask questions of Jesus all the time. I mean, his own disciples asked so many questions that Jesus got to a point to where he was like, how much longer do I have to put up with you guys?
And what you don't find, even amidst my questions, and some questions I don't think have answers. And, I'll get to heaven and I'll be like, okay, that's it. There's answer. But I do feel like with the eyewitness thing, it really does come back to you're talking to people and you're writing this, and the book is being disseminated amongst a culture of people at a time when a corrective voice could rise to the fore. I was talking to a guy named Kent. Kent is on Kent Straith is on our Jacob Sessions podcast, one of the other podcasts that I'm on, and he was talking about on Facebook today how getting in arguments with people on Facebook is somewhat virtuous, if only to insert a corrective voice. Even if lots of people in the group aren't going to listen, even if most of the people in the thread are cheerleaders of the same point of view, by throwing in a corrective voice, if someone comes across that conversation, they might see all the cheerleading and then come across someone who says something sensible. Or maybe not even agree with what he says, but say, okay, well, there is a different point of view other than the one that I have. Even if I think that person's an idiot, at least I know that there's another point of view than the one that I hold to. And I think in that sense, he said, I'm here to be a corrective. I don't let fallacy continue. I mean, and he said, he differentiated between, if someone comes along and says this particular TV show is terrible, that's subjective. And while I think he's wrong, I don't feel like I need to get online and debate him on that.
Right.
But if someone says something that is categorically and objectively false, like Jesus wasn't a real person, if someone gets online and says something like that, then he feels a duty to be a corrective. And I don't think that that's just a Christian thing that people do. I think that's something that non-Christians do as well, and detractors do as well. So if you have all this eyewitness testimony, these people that Luke is sitting down and interviewing, and then he writes his book, and then his book is, quote unquote, published, and it's being circulated, widely circulated. There were enough people alive at the time of the circulation of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that could say, nope, that's not how that went down. That's not how that happened.
Right.
Let me correct you on that. Let me serve as a corrective.
And when people say that, well, in the ancient world, one person speaking up about something not being true wouldn't be enough of a voice to sway anyone. Hogwash. I call hogwash on that, because you've got guys like you've got figures in the early church like Arius and Marcion, who were single individuals who
we need to go back. We need to go back to like first century names for children.
Church life. Yeah, tell me about it.
Marcion, stop hitting your sister Irenaeus. Stop it.
Well, I mean, in some sense, I mean, you still have you've got girls named Lydia.
Yeah, but those are like suburban names at this point.
Those are like suburban. That's funny. We've got early Iron Age names like Elijah still running around.
So you don't have the cooler ones. Like I really love your son's name Elias. I think that's good stuff. I think it's good stuff. I think we're good. I think we're good right now. I think talking about Mark and Luke is fine.
Okay.
I wanted to get
text criticism. We can deal with some of the other stuff, but
yeah. So I mean, Matthew is just written by Matthew. Hebrews. I think we go down a path that we don't have time for.
Right now, yeah,
at the moment. So, but I think going off on the tangent with the eyewitness thing was good. I think.
Yes.
So, and it was planned, so that worked.
It was a planned tangent. We always do better when the tangent is planned. Have you noticed that?
Yes.
Because last time we did one of these, we went on a planned tangent for the homosexuality thing that we had planned ahead of time, and that went quite well.
It did. So I'm excited. This will post on Friday.
Okay. Have you gotten any emails or anything